Okay, hello and welcome to our first public lecture for this term. We have Rukmini S, who's going to talk about her book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths. Data can and cannot tell about modern India. Rukmini is an independent data journalist based out of Chennai, India. She has been a journalist since 2004. Rukmini worked as India's first national data editor with the Hindu for a very long time. She also later worked for Huffington Post on data-driven stories. Rukmini has received the Likho Awards for Excellence in Media in 2019. She received an honorable mention for the Chameli Devi Jain Awards for an outstanding woman journalist. Today, we are joining in to hear Rukmini talk about her recent book, Whole Numbers and Half Truths, What Data Can and Cannot Tell About Modern India. Over to you, Rukmini.
Thanks very much for that, Sushmita. Thanks very much for having me. I've always been very impressed with how engaged the NLS community is, including its alumni, and how engaged they are with the world beyond the law alone. And today, while I do plan to talk a little bit about police and judicial data, I hope to talk more broadly about the areas that my reporting and the book have taken me to, which extend to politics, intergroup relations, economics, migration, health, and others. As you mentioned, I am a journalist. I'm usually based out of Chennai, although I'm just now in Pune. I started as a reporter at the Times of India in 2004, essentially being dispatched to cover whatever was going on in the city, then sometimes in the broader state in Maharashtra, and then in the country. This included reporting from government offices, state assemblies, police stations, trial courts, boardrooms, slum demolitions, protest sites, really the whole gamut of democratic structures in a way. Since 2010, I have been specializing in data journalism, first at the Times of India and then as national data editor at the Hindu, and then as editor data and innovation at HuffPost India. Since 2018, I've been working independently and I write for Mint, India Spend, and a couple of others. So the book came out in December 2021 and has been my way of bringing together the reporting that I did sort of pre and post switching to data journalism, which is trying to integrate experiences from the field and conversations with experts and people on the ground with what the data was showing, because I do feel both have an important place and both in a way complete each other. So I'd like to talk about 5 broad themes that the book brings up and maybe read to you some examples of the points I'm making, and then I'd be happy to take questions from your community. So I'm just going to bring this up. So there's sort of 5 broad themes beyond what the specific chapters tackle that I'd like to talk about. You know, the book is organized as 10 chapters which bring up 10 big questions about the way things work in modern India and try to answer them through a combination of what good data can tell us, as well as what the data, I believe, misses or misleads on. And those are, you know, specific issues around either voting or around spending, around work. But I'm trying to sort of bring together 5 threads that emerge from the book instead of the specifics of the chapters. So one is, I feel quite humbled actually by the breadth and scope of official Indian data. And one of the reasons I feel this is important to acknowledge is because there's sometimes a great skepticism about official anything which extends to official data too. So I often have students or young people ask me, is there really anything that Indian data tells us? Isn't it very old? Does it really capture things? So I want to reiterate that point, that there's a lot that we get from official data. Just a couple of truth bombs from official Indian data that I wanted to drop here. One is, for example, that if you're hearing this, you're almost certainly not middle class, even though we all often like to say that we're middle class. India's most recent official statistics on consumption expenditure, which we use to as a proxy for income as such, come from the National Statistical Office. That's a household survey that asks a representative sample of people about, you know, what they spend their money on. And it shows that the average Indian spends a little under rupees 2,500 on average every month. Anyone in urban India who spends more than 8,500 rupees per month would be in the top 5% of the country. And these figures are from before the pandemic. Now, this is something that we know from official statistics. This hasn't required, any sort of unusual or out of the way survey for this. Another of my favorites is here, this one. On migration, the popular narrative around migration is often of almost like a flood, that there's a flood of people flooding, rushing from rural areas into cities. But the truth is that migration is, the real question about Indian migration is why there is so little of it. If you do not live in the place where you were born, you are already an outlier. Just 5% of the country lives outside the state that they were born in. 63% of people live in the same place where they were born. Among those who have moved away from their birthplace, 59% live within the same district. So migration is really quite rare. Even in the richer western and southern states where there's this narrative around migrants flooding in Karnataka, for example, just 6% of people were born outside the state. This is again something that comes from official data from the census, and we can talk about the problems with the census later. So that is an impressive official architecture that was put in place at the moment of independence, and to read and think about that time is actually quite inspiring, because it was a deeply sort of nationalistic urge that drove the Indian state to put in place a data structure that was out of its league. We were not a rich enough or developed enough country to attempt the kind of statistics that we did at the time, but it has stood us in truly good stead. So that's something to be impressed by. Simultaneously, what's happened, particularly in the last 10-15 years, is the growth of some impressive alternative private data sets. Now, private, the level of availability can range from fully available to fully closed. One of the very good data sets that's been available is called the India Human Development Survey, and we have other sort of private sources that have become available in the last few years. And those give us insights that we don't even know that we know these things about our country. So, for example, through a range of surveys which I've cited in the book, we know that the vast majority of Indians still have arranged marriages. As of January 2018, 93% of married Indians said that theirs was an arranged marriage. Additionally, we know that marrying within your caste remains an important feature of marriage in India. Fewer than 10% of urban Indians, not even all Indians, urban Indians said in a 2014 survey that anyone in their family had married outside their caste. So again, something that we know, that we might not even know that we know from our own data. Then a combination of official and private sources tells us things about the intersections between caste and class, for example. So we know that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India earn the least, followed by Muslims and then OBCs. Forward castes are by far the richest Indians, forward caste Hindus, with a household income nearly 1.5 times the Indian average. So this is a data point that I feel does not make it to popular conversation as much as it should. So those are some of the newer and private data sources that are available. And part of my sort of mission in making this information available and to talk a lot and evangelize about it is because you only feel that there's something worth saving if you know what exists and you find it impressive in some ways. So because there are serious challenges to India's official data architecture, which I'll come to in a minute, it's particularly important to know what an impressive job it does do of talking about Indian realities that sometimes our bubbles don't allow us to learn about. The very fact that you and I might use the phrase middle class for ourselves when we are so far out of what the middle class should be is only something that we know because of official data. So once you see some value in it, then perhaps you want to save it. The other point that is really sort of the central theme of the book in a way, which is that data without context, particularly in India, is almost is pointless, is misleading, and creates false and often dangerous narratives. And this is something that really comes through with crime data, for example. So just to give you an example, I'm sure you've seen this was much more the case in the mid 2010s, but even more so now. Even now, there is a lot of conversation around extremely low rates of conviction in sexual assault cases, and of course, this is a problem. But one of the things that we don't have enough context on in our conversations around crime is that all of our understanding of crime comes from police statistics, from FIRs. And FIRs, as I have found, are a truly problematic building block on which to be building our understandings of everything from safety to interstate comparisons to sexual freedom, sexual agency, autonomy. In 2012, after the horrific assault on a young woman in Delhi, I realized that a lot of the reporting was centered around police statistics. And having been a reporter who'd gone to police stations before that, I knew that this was problematic because I knew the sort of scenes that play out in police stations when FIRs are lodged, and to take it as a statement of fact is of course problematic. Of course, as all law students will consider the question, uh, in no way am I trying to make the case that any of this brings us, sort of defines the truth, but perhaps at least that's what the pursuit was of coming closer to something like a truth. So what I ended up doing is I looked at all 600 trials of IPC 376 in Delhi's 7 district courts in one calendar year. And I read the judgments, I got some additional papers from prosecutors, and I talked to the families on both sides, as well as judges who were quite keen to talk right then because they were getting fried in the press about low conviction rates. And what I found was that in 2013, 460 cases were fully argued before Delhi's district courts. Of these, the largest category, 189 cases, dealt with cases involving consenting couples, often intercaste and interreligious, whose relationships were essentially being criminalized by their families. Um, these almost always resulted in acquittals because the woman would most often testify in court that she was often married, sometimes even had a child with the man in question. So in no way does this mean that sexual assault is not a problem in India, that we should not be looking at data, but it definitely underscored the need for greater context to me. Another sort of story that came up on crime, actually what I was trying to do was replicate the same thing for Bombay. So I was looking at Bombay's district courts and reading up on trials. And one of the things that I noticed in the database is that I kept seeing IPC 328 daily before most metropolitan magistrates. Now, IPC 328 is causing hurt using a poisonous substance. And I could not understand what is the city awash in IPC 328 for. And then what I ended up finding was that at that time, the drug mephedrone, known as Mia Mia on the street, was not in the NDPS schedule. So the Mumbai police had decided, in its wisdom, that they wanted to crack down on the sale of mephedrone. So they used IPC 328 instead. Now, of course, this was the wrong section because for a conviction under 328, you need to show intention to cause hurt. And that is rarely the case in a case of peddling. So this had IPC 328 in Mumbai's courts had 100% acquittal rate, and certainly not coincidentally, the vast majority of the accused were young Muslim men. So if you had been just going by FIRs alone or even by charge sheets, you would have thought that Mumbai was awash with Muslim men trying to cause hurt using poisonous substances, while the truth or something approaching the truth, as I found, was far more complicated. What this also means is that it makes interstate comparisons deeply problematic. So, with crime, for instance, this is something that happens every time the NCRB's reports come out, which, the typical headline is Kerala is the most unsafe, or UP is the safest, or something like that. And I just wanted to show you, just quickly show you something that I'll refer to in a minute. What this is here, what you see here, just think of those 4 quadrants, and I'll explain it in a minute. And what this chart does is it plots reported crimes against women reported to the police in a state proportionate to population as against the number of crimes women say that they actually experience. And how do we know this? Because of household surveys that ask women about crime they've actually faced. And what we find is that what I ended up finding is that the quadrant that we focus on most is the quadrant of highest reported cases to the police, because those are the numbers that come out in the NCRB. But there's another quadrant that worries me far more, which includes states like Bihar and Madhya Pradesh. These are states with the highest reported violence against women, as they say to surveyors, actually experienced by women, but the lowest rates of violence reported to the police. So I really think we've been focusing perhaps on the wrong area, because reporting alone is often a combination of state capacity, the ability to handle with respect and in a fair manner handle complaints, the empowerment levels of the people themselves to come up to you with their complaints, and then sort of the expectation of justice. So to treat police numbers as cricket statistics, as we do, really in India, which is treated like a spectator sport and take it completely at face value, is problematic. And in a sense, I feel it disincentivizes states, because we are essentially vilifying and penalizing states that are perhaps doing just a better job of reporting. Another area of that context is much more needed is when we come to definitional issues. And here I really wanted to give you an example from data on work, on employment. So one of the things that you see in India's official employment statistics is that among the codes that are used for employment, there is one, code 121, which is directors and chief executives. By official data, this is the most common occupation for urban men and the third most common occupation for urban women. So that sounds pretty high skilled and high paying, right? Directors and chief executives. But labor economists find that it might just be a fancy sounding way of describing people who run their own small one person enterprise, essentially your thelawala. Because of the women workers described as directors and chief executives, 99% were actually self employed, of which around one third worked as unpaid family workers. So they were unpaid workers in family enterprises like a small shop. But in official Indian labor classifications, they were classified as directors and chief executives. So this is really an area that brings in the value of combining, to use academic terms, quantitative and qualitative, to use journalistic terms, field reporting and data journalism, but essentially accepting that neither one is going to tell you the full story. All of this sort of valorizing of official data shouldn't detract from the fact that there is a lot of there are areas in which we do lack data. Let's accept that again. So the census, for example, right until now classifies people as agriculture, home-based work, and others. So we know virtually nothing about all the jobs that people graduating from NLS are probably going to take up, because the census does not break those occupation categories down at all. We also seriously lack high frequency data on sectors of the economy, including growth, inflation, labor. And these are areas that increasingly we are turning to the private sector for. What we also do lack quite significantly is data on health, particularly in the private sector. So just to give you an example, India's official health numbers for most diseases comes from its national health profile. And the national health profile itself admits that these are underestimates, because they essentially largely capture data only from public healthcare facilities, and they miss most of private healthcare, which is where the majority of Indians access health from. So the NHP, for example, and there are other models which try to estimate what actual numbers for diseases are. So I'm sort of comparing the national health profile with the global burden of disease estimates. They are flawed, but at least they're sort of some estimates. So the NHP in 2017 estimated 194 deaths from malaria for the whole year, while the global burden of disease, which used multiple sources, estimated 50,000 deaths from malaria for the same year. Estimates for tuberculosis and typhoid incidents were similarly 10 times the official number. And I'm going to get to COVID in a minute, but it's just to also make the point that COVID is not the first time that we started undercounting and underestimating deaths from disease. Another thing that we miss in the data is change on the margins, and I feel like this is something that really comes forward in small conversations. These are changes that may not always be reflected in questionnaires, particularly questionnaires that have over time become very ossified in the way they're conducted. We ask questions around politics, for example, in exactly the same way we've been asking for nearly 60 years. So in those cases, we miss out on a lot of nuance. So just to give you an example of what we miss in this way. So all of the statistics on marriage in India show that there's extremely little intercaste marriage, under 4% typically. And there's a young man who I spoke to for the book who was in an intercaste relationship. And after I, finished looking at all of the data, I told him, you are in an intercaste relationship. I have an intercaste marriage. We're outliers, you and me. Do you feel lonely? Do you feel this? That we're that 3% of the country. And he said it didn't make him feel like an exception because he thought that the data was getting something wrong. He said to me, that's data about marriage, madam, not about love. I think if your data asks people if they have ever fallen in love with someone from another caste or religion, many will say yes. I see that all around me among my friends. But when it comes to getting married, most of us are not yet ready to leave our families. So perhaps, we ask a lot of questions about marriage in India. We ask virtually no questions about, love and relationships. So asking questions in the same way over time is also one of the ways in which we are missing data. So one of the questions I get asked a lot, and I look forward to and hearing if one of you intended to ask me this, is can we trust data? Is it being manipulated? Can we trust anything that the government says? This government, past government, state governments, can we believe them at all? And I actually find that outright manipulation is far, far less common and far less of a problem than other important problems with Indian data. And the reason is not because I have some sort of touching faith in government, but because there are systems put in place for oversight that have typically worked well, but that will need to be safeguarded. We cannot take anything as a given. And I also am a strong believer in the power of Indian journalism. While there are many black sheep, all of the most important stories of the last several years, the last 2 years in particular, have been told by very mainstream and sort of semi-mainstream Indian journalists. And the reason we know anything about two of the sort of biggest data scandals that happened in India in the last 5 years or so is again because of Indian journalists. So the sort of closest I would say that we've come to manipulation is more like suppression, which has happened twice in the last couple of years. In 2019, India's sort of regular calendar of official data meant that we should have had data on unemployment. But it was not clear why that data was not being released, and the official agency, the supervisory agency, had said that the data was ready, it was cleared, it was not being put out. An extremely enterprising young journalist by the name of Somesh Jha, who was in Business Standard at the time, accessed that report and found that it showed that unemployment was at a 45-year high. Yet the report was not released. However, after the 2019 general election, the report was released and it said exactly what Somesh's reporting had shown. So that was a worrying example of suppression, but it came out at least at some point. A more worrying example happened later the same year, where we once again knew that there was data on household consumption, which really forms the bedrock of Indian understanding about poverty, class, everything, was ready but was not being released. Now here we sort of fell one step lower, which is, again, Somesh accessed the report and wrote about it, and it showed a significant slowing down and in fact a decline in real income growth over the period of 2017-18. However, the government then came out to say that there were problems with the methodology, undefined and not new problems, and the report was never put out at all. If you're thinking of slippery slopes and sliding scales, then that was one further step down. I think the question also arises in the case of COVID data, because that's surely an area in which there's been data fudging. That's what most people think. And I just want to take you through a couple of steps that take us to why India's COVID death is an undercount. And it's an enormous undercount. But, not all of these are sort of outright intentional steps. One of this is, as I have explained, that we have a background of poor health surveillance. And this means that we undercount deaths from all diseases. We went into the pandemic with only 9 out of every 10 deaths being officially registered, and just 1 out of every 5 deaths having a medical certificate. So we're already in a situation where we don't typically know the cause of death of most deaths in India. Additionally, what happened is that many state governments set up these audit committees, which were then to decide which were COVID deaths and which were non-COVID deaths. Although the WHO and even the Indian government had recommended a lenient definition of COVID in a pandemic where testing in time is often not possible, most governments, no government followed that, and only a death in which there was a clear progression of disease with a positive test prior to death was officially counted as a COVID death, which meant that lakhs of deaths were missed as a result. And then there was some amount of actual manipulation or fudging of the thought that we think of, the sort that we think about. For example, in the case of a man who I spoke to who lost his wife, who said that she tested positive, then she was in the ICU, and she had been in the ICU for 30 to 45 days in all before she passed. By then her test was negative, but she had already been on a ventilator for a long time and then passed away. But because her last COVID test was negative, she was not counted in the official data. So that comes closer to the sort of fudging and manipulation that we typically imagine. And again, I do have faith in the power of journalism to bring out these stories. Finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way forward, about things to do, because this is again something that often comes up while talking to students, and I'm happy to have this question. I'm overall optimistic, and part of it is from seeing some of the initiatives that have happened in the last couple of years, seeing them up close. So one of the things that's emerged is these collaborative communities of people who are not all directly engaged either in journalism or in data or in public policy. Some might be programmers and developers with day jobs in sort of for-profit companies, but are deeply public spirited and want to lend their programming skills to journalists and others, to extract data and make it publicly available. It's a key feature to have all of this data freely available for everyone. So we saw this in the case of the COVID-19India.org initiative and the COVID-19 Bharat.org initiative now, which I'm a part of. We are also seeing this a lot, I feel, in the case of legal data, where organizations like Daksh based in Bangalore, the work that NLU in Delhi is attempting to do, and of other organizations like Development Data Lab, which brings together data sets from other people who are willing to make it public, tidies it all up and puts it in a freely available format. Similarly with the Civic Data Lab people. So we are seeing some of these communities, but the sort of harder question to think about is, what are the sort of levers of democratic pressure that we need to think about pushing to make these institutional, so that we are not public spirited individuals and volunteers on the side chipping away at core government functions. Even with COVID-19India.org or COVID-19 Bharat, I have a philosophical sort of concern, which is that if we do the job that government is supposed to do, which is we are only putting together official sources of data, we're not doing anything beyond that, but the government has not done it till now. So we do not have historical disaggregated COVID data available on any government website. And so we've had to put it together as volunteer groups. But if we hadn't done that, would there have built additional democratic pressure on the government to do what was a core function of governments across the world? Similarly, I feel this in other cases too, where we are trying to look at alternatives or parallel ways, or other ways to get past what are core government functions. Again, to give you an example, the government has a database called the National Health Missions HMIS, Health Management Information System. For over 10 years now, it has been a given that it's there, freely available online. It's information on things like immunizations, deliveries, inpatient and outpatients in primary health centers, district hospitals, sub-district hospitals across the country, over almost 2 lakh facilities. But ever since I started using that data to do some reporting on the pandemic, first I tried to make the point that routine health services were badly affected during the lockdown. It was promptly pulled offline. Then it came back online. Then I reported that there was some restoration of routine health services, but not to prior levels. Again, it was pulled offline. And then last year, I used it to point to an increase in excess mortality from all causes in rural areas, in particular, where this data is from. And then they took it on offline and haven't yet put it back online. Over 6, 7, 8 months, this sort of vital data set that was a given is offline without a whimper from any political party or anyone in parliament. So we start thinking of alternative ways to access it. Should we put RTIs? Is there someone there we can contact? But I would like to think more about what are the systems to put in place. Perhaps there are legal safeguards to think about. Is there a role to think about a right to public data? I would leave it to the people listening. I am less well placed to think of what that would look like. But I see these silver linings, but I want to think about how to strengthen democratic structures as well. So these are just 5 points that emerged through the book for me. If you are in Bangalore, I would highly recommend the independent bookstores of Church Street to buy any books you want, not just mine. If not, it's also on Amazon. And Sushmita, I'd be happy to take questions now.
Thanks so much, Rukmini. Do we have questions from the audience? You can just raise your hands and I'll call on you. Saurabh?
Yeah, thanks, Sushmita. Thanks, Rukmini, for that presentation, and thank you for all that work that you have done as part of your journalism, and it's always been a very great learning experience for us to go through them. One question that I had, especially as someone who works on labor law, given the difficulty and the discrepancies that we have in the data that you have spoken about, and at the same time, quite a bit of legal analysis also these days revolve around data analysis. What are the ways in which perhaps law students or lawyers or legal academics can be trained, at least in some of the most basic aspects of navigation of data analysis?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's particularly exciting because it is actually one of the areas in which I do feel that I've seen change. So that makes me, it's very good to think about places in which, say, 5, 7, 8 years I felt that this was a complete, black hole, and to think that there has now been some change in it. So even I'd say maybe 7, 8 years ago, there was even a law commission report. It was examining something else, pendency. It was examining pendency, of course, another law commission report looking at pendency. But in the course of it, when they tried to compare across jurisdictions, high court jurisdictions, they ran into the problem that all of us working with legal data run into, which is the sort of, countless numbers of classifications that each high court jurisdiction follows on its own, which makes a comparison difficult. And it had flagged it then. And I remember when they flagged it then, feeling like this is impossible, that I'm never going to be able to do anything useful with legal data. I actually remember feeling that the data stream that was in the worst state in all of India was legal data. It just felt hopeless that I couldn't say anything useful. And I feel such a change already now. And I think that there are several people who have used machine learning tools to do a lot more than what we were able to do then, and to get past some of these classification issues. So, the work of organizations, and not just the work that they are doing, but also the tools that they are developing, and then perhaps might be more available in the future, including from Indian Kanun or even Daksh. We are not there yet. We are not yet in a place where machine learning has solved for just these terrible classification issues. But I see the improvement in leaps and bounds. So this convergence between tech and people interested in the law is actually a pretty inspiring space. I don't have a good enough way to say right now that this is fixed or that this is going to get great really fast, but the speed is really exponential. So while maybe 5-6 years ago I would have said I can't see myself being able to do this reporting, I think that's going to change extremely fast.
Arvind and then Richa.
Thanks, Rukmini. That's absolutely fantastic work. As Saurav has already indicated, I just started reading it. And the first chapter is really fantastic, the one on the criminal justice system.
Yes.
And Mrinal is here as well. So I'll be quite curious to see what he thinks, because he did a lot of work. I'm very happily outing Mrinal in public. A lot of work with the Verma committee report, and the question of how the recommendations came about is something which is really worth thinking about. My understanding, again, is what you have done with the great service you have done is you've talked about the Am I audible?
Sorry, I missed your last two.
I was frozen. Am I there? Can you hear me?
You might want to just read.
No, I was saying that the great service which your book does, I think, is thinking of data with the question of context. Even now, in most forums you go to, people say, "Can we just have data? Can we just have data?" And it's such a meaningless statement, as you fantastically point out, And I thought the point which I really appreciated, which made a big difference, I think, is the entire question of looking at the sexual violence question. That's not an easy thing, because it's so freighted with so many strong ideological overtones, And the fact that you courageously make this point that rape is the category, yes, but underlying it, a lot of cases of consenting sex between two people who are in a relationship, as it were, and the promise to marry cases as well, which you point out too. And the difficulty, I'm curious to know what you think. Why I'm so pleased about this is because the ideological framework is so strong. If you even mention what you've written in your book in certain forums, you'll get shot down, completely shot down. I mean, I will get shot down. I mean, you might face a little easier task. So I'm just curious, how do you face in particular? Okay, let's put it this way. The way I think of feminism, right, I think it's an ethical project. It's an ethical project which is not based on misrepresentation, or not based on a sense of, we don't take data seriously, or we don't say what is the facts before us. If the facts before us indicated that the rape law is being misused to target consenting sex between adults, that's a problem we have to face. We can't ignore that problem. That's where I'd see it, and that's what I think your data is indicating. Of course, that raises a still far more difficult question: is what do you do then? And the other place, I think both Mrinal and Aparna, as well as Kunal, have very strong opinions, is POCSO. Again, everyone is happy with POCSO there, but if the end of the day, a large majority of those cases, or a significant number of those cases, are really targeting sexual relationship between kids who are 16, 17 or 17, 18, then we're in a very, very bad place, And that we need to find some sense of justice for that entire subset of people who are really being targeted very, very badly by the criminal justice system. So what your book is doing is, because these are conversations I've had with practicing lawyers really who are facing this problem and facing ethical questions, saying, this is horrible, how is it that the rape law of POCSO is being used against these kids, and that people are paying for the blood? That's the worst part of it. What do we do about it? The question.
If I can just jump in with a couple of things. Thank you for that. One is that I do want to acknowledge that while I went into this with a lot of trepidation, particularly because this was still, 2012 was very fresh in Delhi's mind still. Let me just acknowledge that all of the leading lights of the feminist movement were completely wanted to know about this, wanted to sit down, wanted to think about it, wanted to know what more to do about it. So I see broad acceptance in the feminist movement about this issue. And in fact, because the feminist movement is largely charged with the issue of autonomy in whatever way it can, women can access it. They do see this too as a affront to the autonomy of women, which it is. There is a crime being committed on the autonomy of young men and women here. It's just a different crime from the one that the IPC section is used. And again, and I'll defer to people like Mrinala and Aparna on this, because I can't say I know how to think about legal reform at all. But when I think about phrases like misuse of the rape law, what strikes me is more sorry, did I freeze for a minute?
No, you're fine.
Okay. When I think about issues, like a phrase like misuse of rape laws or misuse of the POCSO law, I think of it more in terms of what are the sort of accountability mechanisms, particularly for the police, which really strikes me as the site of a lot of this injustice, even before the courts. What are the accountability mechanisms that can be put in place over there? So I suppose I think of it less as a misuse of the law and more as a misuse of policing. Not that I know how to fix either of those problems. And absolutely, you're right about mentioning the problem with POCSO. In fact, Bharti Ali and others from HUC and others have shown this again through the data itself, which is particularly in that 15 to 17 age group. This is a serious problem with the use and abuse of POCSO by some parents and the police as well.
Richa?
One small addition. Also, Rukmini, at some point, the UAPA as well. That'll be great.
Yes, so the work that Article 14 did on sedition is in some ways a good framework to think about going forward with things like the UAPA. And that's what I mean by people like NLU Delhi and others providing in some ways toolkits for others like us, like me, who want to do more work with legal data but feel a bit lost because of all of the technical issues. So I was encouraging the NLU and Article 14 to even write up their process, because it's really a good way to think about how others can do it. Better way than what I did, which was manually like a donkey reading 600 cases. I don't recommend that to anyone.
Yes, Richa, please go ahead.
Thanks, Sushmita. And thanks so much, Rukmini. I also just started reading your book, and I actually started from the chapter on how India votes. And it was a really useful kind of corrective to a lot of the analysis of the assembly elections that's been in the public domain over the last few days. My question was around the point you made about the fact that you don't think that there is too much manipulation of government data, which was heartening to hear. And I wonder if that is more in the context of sort of raw data that the government puts out, where you say there may be more suppression rather than manipulation. But what about instances where there is, sort of an aggregation or sort of some kind of processing of data to come up with a measure or a value? And I'm really thinking of things like GDP data here, GDP data, inflation, even fiscal data, where, I think, for things like inflation data, there may be some institutional safeguards, but much less so for GDP and others. And so do you think that there is, given, for instance, for GDP data, the way measures are constantly changing, methodology is constantly changing, is there more manipulation there? And what are some of the institutional safeguards that you would think would be useful to think about there? I had a second question, but only if there's time.
Sure, I'll forget otherwise, so I'll answer that first. No, that's a great question. And let me first say that there is a substantial amount of lying and misleading using data that does go on to suit narratives across the place, including by the government. Just to, give you one example, in 2015, the government put out 2011 census data on religion. And this, the government press release, and I find press releases a perfect example of lying with data in a way, which is that they're not, the data hasn't been manipulated, but the spin on it is often faulty. And part of the reason that I am sort of, again, evangelical about data, especially to other journalists, and I talk to other newsrooms, and I'm happy to help anyone who wants to work with data, is because it and I'm not trained in data statistics, maths, none of that, but I have sort of basic Excel abilities, and that's why I try to tell people to have at least those abilities, because it frees journalists from the tyranny of the press release. And this is very important if you don't want to be a stenographer, either as a journalist or anyone in public policy. So to come back to the 2015 example, what the press release showed, and it came at 7 p.m. On a weekday, without a press conference, without any sort of context or any Excel sheet with it. It's an Excel sheet, but it said that Muslims growing fastest, Hindus growing slower, and Hindu population now under 80% or something like that. And because I had some familiarity with past census data and had it sort of organized and arranged, I ended up finding that, as expected by demographers, Muslim population growth was slowing rapidly and had actually hit had slowed quicker than it was even expected to. So that was really the story. What's the point in saying that Muslim population growth is higher than Hindus? All groups with less education and less access to health and less incomes have higher fertility, and it changes over time. It's any demographer could say that. So that happens a lot. This sort of misrepresentation without. So they didn't actually manipulate religion data, but by putting this sort of press release out, they did end up dictating what all of the headlines the next day looked like. Again, when it comes to the GDP, yes, especially because it is a much more complex indicator, getting to the heart of it becomes harder. But again, I feel very heartened here by the role that journalists were able to play. So the reason that we know the issues with the methodology of the new GDP series, one is the institutional mechanisms to have to disclose methodology still exist. It can't just be some sort of black box. So journalists and people like Arvind Subramanian were able to pick apart at that methodology. Additionally, there was a database of companies that was used, which news reporting led by Mint and others was able to show had ghost companies and sort of dubious companies in it. So instead of being one step, perhaps that was 5 steps, but it did end up the checks and balances, whether they are the media or other economists, did end up working. So this isn't a good place to be in. It shouldn't require so much work from everyone to get this information out. But in the absence of transparency and openness, at least we do have these other pillars working. So I still feel pretty good about the fact that we do know all of this, right? You and I aren't mystified by why the new GDP series said that. We can argue about it, but we know the math that went behind it, at least.
You want to ask your second question?
Yes. No, thanks so much, Rukmini. That's really valuable. I think a common thread that that I found through a range of your answers and your remarks was also sort of the fact that journalists have brought out issues with suppression or manipulation of data. So I think a lot of the safeguards that we're thinking of really just rely on there being robust media, which I think is a shrinking space, sadly. But I think my question was actually a little different. The other thing that I really enjoyed about your book is that apart from context, what it marries with the data is stories. And I think, you've got sort of, people's quotes and people's kind of stories that that kind of give that make the data much more relatable. So I think my question was more than, I think, the fact that your advice that everyone should be able to use Excel is really valuable. But I think what would be great is to hear from you in terms of how journalism can marry sort of data crunching with on the ground reporting. For instance, I think, Snigdha Poonam's Dreamers is like a really good companion volume to Whole Numbers and Half Truths. So I think it'd be great to see how, sort of the narrative form and data can merge to tell a more rounded story.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I spend a lot of time thinking about it, and it actually vexes me, this issue, because while I love stories and I truly love them, I love the reporting of it, I love the telling of it, I love the listening of it. I have actually a harder sort of ethical and moral and sort of journalistic questions around the use of stories than I have around the use of data, which is because these are extremely subjective decisions. Whose story to tell? Are you going to tell the outlier story? Are you going to tell the story of the representative person, but then you're missing all the nuance? These are very difficult decisions. And I don't think that I followed a very consistent system. The other thing that happens with data journalism a lot is that there's almost this sort of formula, which is humanize your story. Start with a story, humanize your data. Start with a story, draw in the reader, and then they'll, be able to take the medicine with the honey and take your. I don't know. I find that extremely infantilizing and patronizing. And sometimes I don't feel that that has to be a formula that all of us follow each time. So I actually struggle with knowing what stories to use, when to use them. And my solution was just to do whatever I wanted, because some of the stories I've used actually undermine the point the data is making. And I'm okay with that, because I do make the argument in the book that data doesn't capture the entirety of Indian realities. Indian realities are messy. And anything that tries to be very neat, either a data set or journalism, misses all the messiness at the edges. But then I would sympathize with someone writing, a quantitative report, for example, who wants to use a few stories in it. I can't imagine whose stories you would use, whether you would try and use the median person's story. So, it does sound like the right thing to say, that marrying stories and numbers is a good way going forward. It does make it engaging to read, but it's very hard to choose whose stories to tell and what the sort of ethical thing around it is. I don't think I have a good answer to it right now. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat box by Kaushik Parkhe. What do you think of availability of certain types of data as a human right? For example, the data from a caste census.
That's a great question, and it's something I should talk to more people engaged in law and public policy about, because I'll start immediately by saying that I have no idea what the current legal status of a right to data is. I will say that it's something I thought a lot about when the government kept pulling that HMIS data off, which is, isn't there some legal framework in which I have a right to this data? And similarly, I would say, the caste census, the data was collected. So we citizens of the country gave this information in the expectation that it would be in some way used, made public, whether anonymized in some fashion. So what is our right then to it? Do we just accept that it's never going to come out? So I suppose this is all a long way of saying that I don't know what the legal status is, but I do feel that that this is something we need to talk about more in a rights-based fashion, so that just the very fact about the household consumption expenditure data that got suppressed as well, it felt not just as an affront to me sort of morally, it felt like a legal affront as well, which is, there is a schedule, this is a statutory body, it produces these things. Once, if they just decide that they don't like the numbers, can they just not put it out? Are there no legal repercussions to it? So yeah, don't know the answer on legal status, but do think that this is something some of us together should think and talk about.
If there are no more questions, maybe I have one. Okay, Ayush. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Am I audible first of all?
Yes, you are.
The at this as you have addressed in your presentation, that the data that we have available at the moment, that is, we don't have much of a context in that. We don't have context. So like also you have addressed that we have a lot of data manipulation as well as other problems that we are facing in this field of journalism as well as data and statistics. So in such a scenario, how can what could be some of the ways in which we can bring more context on the table or to the data and improve the data?
Great question. Thank you so much for that. I think the very first step is to pay attention, which is when data comes out, we need to be engaged enough and pay enough attention to understand how it was produced. Typically when data comes out, the reporting is all around what the data says rather than how the data was produced. So that's when taking that step back and figuring out that people who are designated as chief executives in the data are actually, Tilawalas, becomes important. And perhaps if we understand or we pay attention and invest that time in understanding these systems before the data comes out, when the data does come out, we're able to understand it, report on it, think about it, read it with that background context to it. I similarly feel about the pandemic as well, which is that many of us should have gone into the pandemic with this prior knowledge about how Indian data on health and on deaths exists. So then we wouldn't have, after the first wave, been asking ourselves, how is it that UP has such few deaths? We would have been saying, oh, we do know that UP has a very weak institutional structure and systematically underreports deaths from other diseases. So let's maybe spend more time thinking about whether UP is missing a lot of deaths rather than sort of assuming that it's doing a great job, as everyone did after the first wave, for example. So doing this hard work in peace times before there's a crisis, before reports and numbers come out, is the work that really needs to happen. And I don't know what this needs to be like. Does the solution need to be more journalism that tells you what goes into the making of data? And for this, I recommend a column that has started in Mint by Mint's own former data editor, Pramit Bhattacharya. And the name of the column is, I think, Lies and Statistics or something like that. So he sort of explains the background to some key data sets. And it doesn't necessarily mean that something has happened right now, but he's sort of telling you their backstory. So that sort of work, if we had more of it, then we wouldn't be, flailing about when numbers come out to figure out what they say. Like the day the NCRB numbers come out cannot be the day on which we begin our understanding of how crime works in the country. That needs to happen before, and perhaps the job falls on journalists, people in public policy, people in the legal profession, all of us.
Thank you for the answer.
I had a similar question to what Ayush was asking, which is precisely as to how do we, as say, who are not trained in data in so many ways, we don't deal with data on a regular basis. How do we, as students of law or politics, begin to understand when we see a graph? How do we even begin to say voice the skepticism that should be about a particular data? But once again, congratulations on the book. It's a fantastic piece of work. Like I think so many people have already said. I read the book like in one go. It's an absolute joy to read. Thank you so much for writing this book. It's such important work.
Thank you so much.
Also, someone is asking if the book is available after March 31st.
Yes, it will. It will continue. I cannot get into details right now, but it will continue. Don't do any panic buying, even though that's something I should encourage as an author. Don't do any panic buying. It will continue.
One last question from Sabit. Thank you for writing this book. What sort of training skills development exists for journalists in India? Would partnerships with universities to develop such programs would be a good idea? Furthermore, given the current political context around some controversial data, Are there incentives to report data that is critical of the government agencies?
All great questions. There is some amount of training for journalists that is going on. There's a couple of organizations that focus on giving data skills to journalists, and many of these courses are free or can be arranged through an employer. So there is a bit of that going on now. For people who are not journalists or with newsrooms, there's also some of this available freely online. There's the Data Journalism Network, there's the Global Investigative Journalism Network, and all of them have data journalism modules, many of them freely available online. Partnerships with universities, sure, yeah, I do see that a bit. Like I see some work going on with a couple of universities who are in talks to have these collaborations between their students, faculty, and some news organizations. So that too is going on. Again, the collaboration between NLU and Article 14 on the sedition cases is one good example of that. So yeah, let me not deny that it is much easier to not say critical things right now. It's always much easier to not be critical of any government, and yes, there is it's in particular harder, even harder now. But journalism has still told us the important stories of the last couple of years. It's told us the stories of COVID. It's key national security questions. All there's a significant amount of substantial critical journalism that's happened in the last few years. So while difficult, there are people working hard enough and brave enough to keep doing it. So what best we can do then is to think about how to support people doing this, right? Whether it is through paying for news that's doing this job, and not sort of relying only on freely available news that relies on ads, which then rely on governments and then result in incentives to not criticize the government. So we should start by that. None of these are expensive websites. We should start by paying for good journalism. But I don't feel despondent. I don't feel like this is not going on, and tomorrow if something happened either with data or something significant with the government, we're not a banana republic. We're still in a place where I can count on Indian journalism to come through. We just all, it's fine to make fun of and laugh at the clown show on TV every night, but the less energy we spend on that and the more time we spend on good journalism that does exist and amplify it and pay for it, hopefully we create good incentives to push back against these bad incentives.
On that hopeful note, thank you so much, Rukmini, for this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for being here and making this possible.
Thank you so much, and superb questions. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.